I'm Danielle Smith with the Alberta Enterprise Group. We're doing this project with Common Sense Edmonton, looking into the municipal election in Edmonton and interviewing all of the candidates for City Council. Joining me now is your candidate for Ward 9, Tim Cartmell. Tim, I know that the candidate or the riding name is changing, so tell us the name of your ward.
Well, thanks for having me. The new name is pihêsiwin, so Land of the Thunderbird is generally what that means, as I understand it. So,
all right, let's go into talking a little bit about the issues. You're running again for office, so you are the incumbent. So you must have a little bit of unfinished business. So first, let me deal with what are the things that you've done over your years in on council that you feel particularly proud of.
Well, thanks for the question. You know, when I ran in 2017, I felt at that time a couple of things. I felt that Southwest Edmonton, being the fastest growing part of Edmonton and one of the fastest growing parts of Alberta, quite frankly, was not seeing a proportional investment in infrastructure. And so that was a key piece for me. And what we have seen is announcement of and support for the full build of the improvements to Terwillegar Drive. With a little bit of lobbying and a bit of conversation with my provincial colleagues, we see expansion of the Anthony Henday Drive through the southwest corner. More locally, worked a lot with the developers in our area to have them complete their responsibilities. And a lot of that is roads, but some of that is playgrounds and parks and things like that too. So I would say that we have seen a remarkable amount of infrastructure investment in our part of the city. So quite proud of that. But I think we have more work to do. We have more work to make our communities a bit more livable. A bit more of a place where there's entertainment and employment and education and living all in kind of one place. This is still a bit of a corner of the city where you have to leave for some of those things. So still some work to do. Yeah.
You know, I may just jump into that a little bit on the development and housing issues, because the concept of a 15-minute community, I think, is very appealing to a lot of people. So what is it that you hope to achieve with that? What do you think some of the deficiencies are that need to be addressed in your area?
Yeah, great question. So from a deficiency perspective, we're still a little bit light on schools. Now that's a provincial responsibility, but I think there's a way. I think we have part of that responsibility too. From this perspective, I'm not sure that we've planned our neighborhoods in a way that provide enough spaces for schools. I think we've built just about all of our sites, and yet we're still a bit deficient on capacity. So we need to think about that as we develop further south and develop more new property. More new land. But more than that, I think that we need to think about, where was I headed with this? Community schools is a bit of a hub, you know, and in what sequence we build some of the amenities that neighborhoods depend on. You know, generally speaking, the developers put in the roads, they put in the lots, they may develop the park, they may even do the playground or a bit of a community center, depending on the neighborhood. But what do you need to actually live and thrive in that neighborhood? You need your school. You need the support amenities like a daycare, like a grocery store, like a service station. And so what can we do as a city that accelerates the development of some of those amenities and perhaps makes them a requirement before the next subdivision is built or the next housing development is constructed? From a city perspective, I think our part of that is in those other services, so recreation and libraries specifically. What can we do to accelerate those developments? Right now, Edmonton is in this sequence of the mega rec center, the $200, $300 million center. Those are very difficult to contemplate in ordinary time. They're going to be really difficult to contemplate on the heels of COVID and recovering from that. So do we need to break those things up into parts and build a little part here, a little part there, a little part, you know, in the next neighborhood? Make each one of those communities a bit more walkable. Give each one of those communities a focal point and a place of community and of discussion and of reading and of fitness. So I think there's more that we can do to sort of evolve the model a little bit in terms of development.
You mentioned about new Greenfield Development, and I'm trying to understand the city strategy a bit on this. So the new Edmonton City Plan focuses on urban development, promoting more density, more transit. We talked about the 15-minute communities, and restricts new housing development in the outskirts of the city. I'm wondering, are you concerned that this is going to affect affordability in the long run, or do you think that there's enough land in the land bank that you'll be able to do both, densify as well as build new communities? Tell me where you think the city plan's going with that.
Yeah, I think that there's an opportunity to do both, but I think we're going to have to be a little bit more pragmatic in how we're going to achieve those goals. From the general perspective, an idea that we want to not expand the footprint of the city any more than we absolutely have to, but at the same time attract growth, attract new generations, attract youth to allow our communities to continue to thrive. How do we do that? Well, the city does have several areas of large-scale development, but we've been quite aspirational and, quite frankly, quite restrictive on those things. So Blatchford Field would be one example, the site of the old city airport. Right now, the city is developing that. Right now, the city is the developer. Right now, you need to attach yourself to the geothermal utility in order to be a developer on that site. I'm not sure that makes the most sense. I think that, first of all, when you think that government is going to be the most innovative in these things, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right path. If we believe that our private sector is going to be the most innovative, that our private sector is going to be the most adaptable and nimble to reach market forces and to meet them, maybe we ought to get out of the way. So if our aspiration is housing that is net zero and perhaps ultimately zero emissions, and those are two different things. If our aspirations are for density, well, then let's just say that. Give us developments that are net zero, give us developments that meet our density goals, do them here and do them now. And let our greenfield developers, have access to some of that land and some of those development opportunities. And quite frankly, get out of the way and let innovative private sector companies be innovative and deliver our communities.
Do you think there will be much greenfield development in the coming years? I guess because there are so many adjacent municipalities that if you don't get what you want in Edmonton, you could always move to one of the adjacent communities. Does that concern you?
It does a little. The thing about greenfield development is this. I mean, that is where the growth has typically been, and that's where affordability has typically been. So how do we make some of that filling in of the spaces more affordable? How do we attract that affordability into the core where we want to see the development? I think that's part of the equation. From a city perspective, the analogy I use is like building an arena. When you build a brand new arena, the top ring of seats at the very top is the least lucrative set of seats, right? It goes for the least amount ticket price. It's probably sold to somebody that's not going to spend as much money on merchandise or refreshments. It's the most expensive seat to build and brings you the least money. It's the same thing at the edges of the city. It's the most expensive lot to service, but it's going to bring you the least in terms of revenue or of support capacity. So filling in the spaces makes a lot of sense. There's an economy of scale there that makes a lot of sense. So I don't necessarily view that as a risk if we allow ourselves to develop to fill in those places, but to fill them in an affordable way where anybody can reach them.
Okay, let me talk about the other aspect of the affordability issue, because our big cities always have issues of homelessness, and obviously Edmonton is no different. How do you feel about the progress being made on that? Is it a core city job, or does that require other levels of government to weigh in to get to a resolution?
Well, when you were talking about, there's a danger of using glib terms and overgeneralizations. And so, I don't want to offend anybody when in speaking in that way. In very broad terms, a lot of our homeless population is dealing with both a mental health issue and an addictions issue. And those are healthcare perspectives. And we don't have a Ministry of Health. And we all, as residents of Alberta, pay income tax to the government of Alberta to take care of our health ministry. So there's no doubt that the solutions here need to be collaborative between at least the municipal and the provincial level of government and the federal level of government. Now we've had, and the elephant in the room, quite frankly, is the relationship between our city and the province. And I think it's relatively healthy at the bureaucratic level, not particularly healthy at the elected level. That needs to change. I think if we're going to find our way to collaborative solutions, if we're going to find our way to starting from a place of what do we agree that the outcomes are, what do we agree that the desired end state is, how are we going to move together in that direction? I think it starts with building that relationship at the elected level. So I think it starts there. And I quite frankly think that we share a lot of those goals. We just need to find a way to communicate with each other a lot better and get started on the work.
Let's talk a bit more about collaboration, because there appears to be a pretty good collaboration with the 13 municipality partnership on a variety of issues, but increasingly as well on economic attraction. Tell me what you hope comes out of that.
You mean in terms of the Edmonton metro region?
Correct.
Yeah, well, I think that we're trying to, there's a colloquialism, hunt as a pack. And I think what we're trying to do is diminish and develop essentially an environment of trust where we're not competing with each other for the modest investments or the modest developments, but that we're working together as a group to bring the bigger developments that allows the whole region to thrive. We've heard it just a couple of days ago with the hydrogen announcement of this essentially a pilot plant, but a pretty sizable pilot plant that's coming to Edmonton. Now, it is going to be in the city of Edmonton, but it's in the region of Edmonton, and it's something that is going to support the evolution of that oil and gas industry that surrounds this city. And so it's both good for the city and good for the region. Quite frankly, if it had been, a mile west or a mile north and it ended up in one of the counties, that's just fine as well. So the next piece of the puzzle goes to a different jurisdiction, but that rising tide floats all our boats. And I think that we're beginning to see real collaboration and cooperation with our region neighbors on that.
There's a process taking place right now to revitalize downtown. Just give me some thoughts that you might have on how important downtown is and what kind of things you'd like to see to push that along.
Well, downtown is the heartbeat of the city. It's generally it's seen as an indicator of the health of the city. When you arrive in the downtown of any city, that's a lot of the time visitors' first impressions. And when you're trying to attract business and economic development and expansion of the economy, that first impression's got to be a good one. So we have a couple of overlapping issues there, and one is that right now it's a quiet place. It's a desolate place. So coming off the heels of COVID, we need to enliven our downtown. And the first step to that is people. Edmonton's a government city. No getting around that. A significant amount of that space downtown is government space. So I think governments can lead by example by having people get downtown as quickly as it's safe and as quickly as people are comfortable so that we begin to enliven those spaces. We do need to solve this poverty and homeless concern, so that we're treating our vulnerable populations with care and dignity and respect, but also in a way that allows our downtown to thrive and allows our shopkeepers and our business owners in downtown to feel safe and secure and feel that is a lively, vibrant place. So I think it starts with that. The city has done a couple of things to try to accelerate some of that enlivenment. Most recently, for residential buildings of a certain size and of a certain amount, we'll see that we're not going to progressively charge them property tax until their projects are complete. That's a bit of a change. Gives them a bit of a break on their operating costs until they can actually build the building and get people in it. We're hoping that is going to have some incentive for downtown, and it's actually had some traction. So I think there's parts that the city can do, both that are investments of real money, but things that the city and the province can do that are tangible and don't cost anything. And then, in terms of enlivening and adding that vibrancy and that people space back.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about taxes, because you came up with a good example of how you can use tax policy to give support and business attraction. So talk to me more generally about the tax picture. Are you concerned about the level of taxes on business and residents? Is it mostly business? Is it mostly residents? Give us your take on that.
Well, I don't know that we know how big a problem we have, and honestly, maybe it's not as big as some might fear. But I think we have a real question again coming off of COVID of once those federal and provincial grants are no longer flowing, how many people are in real financial trouble? How many cannot meet their operating burdens? So the last thing we as a city want to do, whether it's residential or commercial or business, is add to someone's operating cost burden by raising their taxes. Now, people hear that and they hear a promise that their taxes won't go up. And we're stuck with this, complicated and intricate a process that is handed to us by the Municipal Government Act, where we determine your proportional amount of tax by the value of your land, and that goes up and down every year, which means even if the city has got a flat line on taxes, some are going up and some are going down, and that can be a confusing message. But from a macro level, a high level, we cannot add to that burden. Quite frankly, it would be my goal that we diminish from that burden. Well, how do we do that? I think there's a couple of lenses we can look at. I think the first is, what is the size of our economy? And what does that mean in terms of the size of the government that this economy can support? I don't know that we've ever done that. In a way, in using this as an example, the limit on your credit card is determined by your income, not by how much money you can spend. But the limit on our debt and the limit on our debt spending is determined by our operating budget. And we can increase our operating budget anytime we want and just increase taxes. So our debt limits are tied to spending, not to capacity. What's our capacity? Let's talk about what our capacity is. Let's talk about what cities should do and what they shouldn't do. How many lines of businesses are we in that we ought not be in, or that right now we can't afford to be in? So we need to have those conversations. Those are difficult conversations. They're hard conversations. 60% of what we spend our money on are wages, which means we're talking about people's jobs. But ultimately, we need to make sure that this city can thrive, that it has a private sector that can thrive, that will then in turn provide the opportunities that all of us want to see.
Let's before I get into some of the specifics around how you'd approach that right sizing of government, a couple more things. What oftentimes when we've talked about the issue of city charters, the issue of new taxation powers have come up. And I think part of it is there a way to get more revenue in without putting the burden on property? But do you support new tax powers for the city?
No, I don't. And I think a prime example, if you go back, I'm not sure how long, say 15 or 20 years, is when school boards had the opportunity and the power to tax to support their own narratives. And we had a collective accumulated debt for school boards across Alberta of some $8 or $9 billion that ultimately the province had to bail out those school boards and had to pay that back. I do not like the idea of more taxation opportunities or debt opportunities. And saying it quite plainly, the provincial debt is treated like a credit card where we pay the minimum balance, but we don't actually pay down the principal. Municipalities are not allowed to do that. We are required by law to pay down the debt and the service and the principal. I want us to stay in that place. We can make it less confusing though, and we can and less administratively costly. And that would be, as has been proposed over the last several years, tying what the province does for cities to the state of affairs at the province, taking the politics out of it. So if municipalities and big cities are going to get a proportion of government revenue, tie it to what the government is going to make in any given year and take the mystery out of it. Let us plan for that and essentially take all of that back and forth and lobbying and nonsense, honestly, out of that conversation. Let's just tie it together. We could even do a couple of other things. Why are we collecting property tax to support education? Pay for all the education at the provincial level and account for it properly and leave that at the point of accountability that it should be. That's another quirk that people don't always understand about their property tax. But make sure that the cities don't just consume that room and overspend, right? I think there's a solution there. But you could also match that to the grants that the province typically gives municipalities. So in other words, province, you pay for education and stop giving us grants. We'll take the whole taxation room that we have at the municipal level and govern ourselves accordingly. There's a way to simplify this. We don't need necessarily additional tax opportunities. What we need to do is take advantage of the money that's already in the system and use it more wisely.
All right. Let's talk about right-sizing government, because Edmonton faces a bit of a challenge in that because Edmonton is in the capital region and you've got lots of places that you can live outside that region. I've often heard the argument that Edmonton has to pay for more services than they have in tax base associated with that. So when you're trying to benchmark what the right size of Edmonton is, it's a little bit more complicated. So how would you do that?
It's tricky. And, this is where we may look to more regional collaboration. And, that might be a longer play, but that's where I think we need to think about that. When we compare Edmonton to Calgary, they're cities of roughly the same size. But in very general terms, 1/3 of the people in Edmonton pay half of what the other 2/3 pay. That's not what happens in Calgary. Everyone pays the same amount, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's, proportionally anyway. So, is there a correction there? Beyond that, Edmonton is not just serving, the other 12 municipalities and counties. We serve the Northwest Territories. We have more penitentiaries here than any other city in Canada, I think, of this size. So we are proportionally serving a much larger population than is denoted by our census. So, what does that mean? Perhaps there's more regional cooperation that could come into play here. And where does that start? Well, we're already starting it with regional transportation, new commission that's just been stood up. We're talking about regional collaboration on utilities, waste management being the next one. We might talk to the federal government about perhaps a little bit more support, considering we have a federal penitentiary on our edge, and that we might need a bit more support from that. Because what does that lead to? Does that contribute to our homeless population? Does that contribute to our, to the number of people in our vulnerable populations that we in turn need to support? And yeah, more regionally, a lot of that social service work that is done in the region lands at the feet of the city of Edmonton and lands at the feet of the city taxpayers. So there's some reconciling to do. How do you do it? Tricky.
That's the big challenge.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about infrastructure, which is another huge ticket item when you get away from operating expenses. There have been a number of significant delays in LRT construction for the Valley Line Southeast. What's your understanding of the reason for those delays? And is there a better process that can be used to prevent that in the future?
Well, the delay, I think the delays are in part attributable to trying to build a linear piece of infrastructure that is that much money. And that's not to defend some of the errors and faux pas in the process. But, when I build a building that's 30, 40, 50 stories, that's built on a piece of property that you can see the unknowns as fairly well defined. When you take that building and lay it on its side, you now have a much larger risk that you're going to find something that you didn't anticipate. So some of that lives in there. I will say, though, that we are not effective in the way we manage projects. And, I'll outline why. And I know that this is provocative, but essentially for our new work, not for our maintenance work, but for our new growth work, we are owner representatives. We don't actually self-perform that work. We don't deliver that work. We hire contractors to do that work. But the way contracts work, the way construction works is you need to make decisions in a nimble, quick, and decisive and determined basis in the moment. I've got a 30-year experience in managing projects. You get a phone call from a site that says, we're waiting on your answer. You give them an answer. That's generally not the city approach. That's not the government approach, right? Half our staff are off on Monday. The other half are off on Friday. We have lots of people that work for the city of Edmonton. So, and I've had this experience myself. You get into a meeting with people from the city, you get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in a meeting, but not the decision maker, not the authority. So the decision doesn't come in the moment. The decision comes after a meeting, after a meeting, after a meeting. We stretch that timeline out. So how much of the stretching out of the LRT timeline is because we stretch out the way we do our work, because we don't feel that urgency and we don't have that discipline to return answers to questions as quickly as the construction site needs them. I think that is a big piece of why we run into trouble.
Can you talk then a little bit about how you would address some of the staffing issues? Because that is also a driver of expenses. And the recent report found the number of employees with middle management had increased 22%. Supervisors increased 19% since 2017. Is that part of the problem? And if it is, what do you do about that?
Well, what you do about that is pretty tricky, because there's also a question of how many are covered by the union agreements and how many are beyond that. What has the growth been within the union positions and what has the growth been outside of that? And we have, open discussions on all of our union agreements right now. So I have to be careful what I say in terms of those agreements. But in general terms, I think we need to examine how many people we have in those positions and examine the flow of work, examine, the depth of the organization from the top level to the bottom, examine the breadth of the organization from how many people report to each supervisor, and we're going to need to reconcile that.
Mm-hmm.
That gets hard because ultimately what we're saying is we need to reduce the number of positions at the City of Edmonton. So how do we do that? Well, there's ways, I think, to do that that are not necessarily draconian, but that consider how many people have enough years of service for retirement, for instance. How many positions can be shared, those kinds of things. So I think we examine all of those possibilities. I think we start from a place of what is the right size of the organization, department by department, branch by branch, layer by layer. I think that's the hard work. I think we've asked our administration to do some of that. I think, quite frankly, after the election, it's going to take council rolling up its sleeves, getting down in the weeds a little bit, and starting to demand some of these answers in a more clear and decisive way.
No, yes, and of course, whenever you talk about looking at austerity or rollbacks or cuts on your frontline staff, it always comes back. Well, what about council members? Are you prepared to see your own compensation package reduced? Do you think council members are compensated fairly, or do you think that there should be some changes there?
I think they're compensated fairly in the context of being public servants. If you're in this work to get rich, you're in the wrong place. I think that we are compensated fairly. I think our work has value. Over this last 18 months, I've never worked more hours and worked harder in my life. And I think that has value, and I would like to be valued for it. At the same time, we as a council agreed that we would freeze our wages for the next 2 years. So they're not going up. I don't think they need to go down. I think they're fair. So I think as a starting point, that's what we're talking about for council. And when we talk about wages, when we talk about wage brackets, that's really actually not the focus for city council. It's more about the numbers. It's more about the number of employees and number of positions and how productive those positions are. It's not about cutting wages necessarily. It's about making sure that we're nimble, effective, and efficient in the work that we're doing.
All right. I have a sort of a grab bag of questions to ask you here at the end as we close up. Just asking a question about how you approach the issue of public transit, because we've talked about some of the concerns on managing those big projects. There's another number of big projects with the Valley Line West, Metro Line Northwest, Capital Line South. Is this the right approach with the LRT, or is there a better way to deal with some of the transportation issues?
Well, I view the LRT as somewhat inequitable. Now, the thing is, we got to remember we're going to have 3 LRTs in Edmonton here when the West Line is done. We're going to have what we used to call rapid transit, which is the original line, which is owned and operated by the city. We're going to have the line to the southeast, which will open, either end of this year or beginning of next, which is a low-speed streetcar-esque tram that is going to be operated by a third party. And then we're going to have the other half of that line, which is that low-speed tram-type vehicle, operated by the city. I'm not sure how we're going to do all of that effectively and efficiently. More than that, though, where we've concentrated LRT and connected those big nodes, has been relatively efficient. But this new style of LRT really is about as effective as a series of buses. And so what I would have, and we don't have the demand yet for transit in Edmonton. Our demand has been stuck at about 9% of commuting trips for 20 years or more. So I would have taken the approach that we actually try to build a robust bus system that has a service that is reliable, dependent, in dedicated lanes, warm, connected, safe, and that we generate a competitive system so that people are willing to at least consider transit as competitive with their personal vehicle. And that once we had built that demand, then we could look to things like rapid transit and to LRT. Now in Edmonton, we have some LRT in our core. So I looked to Ottawa, and Ottawa took that approach, and they have ridership as high as 28% in some of their commuting communities on peak hours. That's a pretty high ratio. They're now migrating to rapid transit in their core, and they're struggling a bit with that. We already have the advantage of having rapid transit in our core. So I would be focusing now on robust bus service across the city, as opposed to massively expensive railways along a couple of alignments of our city.
All right. Let me talk about another aspect of transportation issues because it has been controversial reducing the speed limits for traffic in residential areas down to 40 kilometers per hour. Some want to go to 30 kilometers per hour. What's your view on that?
Well, when we first had this conversation, I have communities that have speeding concerns and speeding vehicle concerns, and so we would do speed studies for those in those areas. And consistently what we would find is 80, 85, 90% of vehicles are traveling at 40 kilometers or less on those local roads and those local collector roads, the roads that we're changing the speed limits on. So what does changing the speed limit do? I'm not sure that it has any material effect. And so I did not support that change. And the financial effect is that we dump a whole lot of money into putting up signs instead of putting up things that actually change people's behavior in those problematic sites. There's no money for speed bumps. There's no money for curb bulbs, but there's all kinds of money for more signage to put up speed limit signs. And so I didn't agree with that approach. I will say, however, over the last year with COVID, relying on people's good graces to be respectful of the neighborhoods they're passing through, to slow down a little bit, to stop making so much noise, we haven't seen as much of that as I'd like to see. So maybe this change in speed limits it will have that indication that we have higher expectations of our drivers. I'm not sure.
All right. Let me ask you sort of a philosophical question about the role of the private sector and P3 type partnerships. So you already have half the garbage collection that's private. Should you privatize the remainder of garbage collection? Conversation about whether golf courses should be run by the city or whether that should be privatized. Do you generally support that kind of approach or not?
I support looking at it. We do have one golf course city-owned that is operated by a private entity, and it's operated very well. So it's not unprecedented. Could we go to the other three? Sure, I don't see why not. And there's I think there's opportunities there for again for efficiency of operations with waste management. The city's trying to be innovative and migrate its waste management systems to contemporary approaches. Where do those contemporary approaches come from? The private sector, right? Mm-hmm. It's waste management that is done privately in other places. So might we privatize waste management? I think we should look at that. Would I privatize the operation of transit? No, I would not do that. Transit is a service. It's a service that needs to integrate across the city. Look at transit from this perspective. If we left it to the private sector to provide, they wouldn't do it. Greyhound just left Canada because it's very hard to provide effective, affordable transportation. So it's going to be a city service. If it's going to be a city service, I'm not sure that it's an exclusively a city service. So I'm not sure that we should be looking at the private sector for that. But there's places for it, I think.
All right. Let me ask you about a controversial project, the solar project in the River Valley that EPCOR got approval for. Not overwhelming. It was a 7-6 vote. I believe you were opposed to that. Yeah. And I'm wondering if that is a project that in hindsight, do you think the right decision was made, or do you think it should be reconsidered?
So this is one of those decisions that's not a black and white, yes or no binary decision. I see the positives on both sides. I followed the thread of conversation and of analysis that EPCOR was putting forward. And essentially, they were trying to get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of having at least part of the energy that the city of Edmonton consumes come from renewable resources. Mm-hmm. That's fine. But this is not the most cost-effective way that they could have done it. There was more cost-effective ways. So there was a switch in logic path that I didn't quite follow. Now, if there's going to be a place where we can put generation, it's right next to a city facility that will consume that generation without going into and out of the grid, which has a whole other set of bureaucratic gates to pass through. So I can see the rationalization around the solar farm next to that water treatment plant. There is a question of what trumps climate and ecology or climate change by going to renewable resources, and that's kind of one of these. And I was quite frankly 50-50 on all of those arguments. What pushed it over for me was that that particular piece of property has an Indigenous context to it, and some from the Indigenous communities were supportive of the project, some weren't. And I was uneasy about sort of accepting one or the other from that perspective. So that tipped me over to a kind of a 60-40 against. It's going ahead. We're going to build it. So let's make it as good as we can make it.
All right. Let me ask a question. It's been a bit controversial in the last year, the movement of defunding the police. When I say that, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it's provocative language that is trying, first of all, that's trying to call attention to some of the things we've seen with police work generally across our continent. I'm not sure that all of that context applies in Edmonton, but certainly some of it does. And so it raised a question that we needed to begin to examine. And it raised a question that I think we all have to examine from the perspective of what is our lived experience? What is our understanding of the issues? And there's a lot in there. This does kind of go back to the vulnerable populations, homelessness and shelter approaches. It goes to how people that are of visible minorities are treated by the police, and there's overlap in that. There's questions about whether the police are the most capable to deal with issues of mental health and addictions in the moment. But I don't, and so there is that provocative language, and I think underpinned by a bit of a notion that if we just transferred some of the resources to other social service agencies, that all would be healed. Mm-hmm. We need a longer look at that. I think that there certainly is a resetting of the social service ecosystem that has to take place to get us to better outcomes. There's no question of that. But I don't think it's as simple as just taking a part of the police budget and that cures all ills. There is $7.5 billion put into the social service ecosystem in Edmonton every year. A lot of that money does not have what the police service has in terms of an umbrella organization that talks about outcomes, that talks about solutions, that talks about improvements, that talks about efficiency and effectiveness of the dollars spent. So I think we need to add an element of accountability across the system. And with that level of accountability, we will see where there's a need for improvements, and we can begin moving the pieces in the whole system around so that we get better outcomes from everyone. Lots of work to do, not fast work, but work that needs to be done. And that too has a provincial element too, when we talk about the Police Act and oversight and accountability and rules and regulations.
Completely. I do have a little bit of a lighter question to ask you. I'm looking at a picture of the think tank library downtown. So do you love it or do you hate it?
Well, can it be provocatively and fondly ugly? I don't know. It's I know when you look at it on the inside, it's fantastic, right? So inside looking out, it is a wonderful addition to our city. Outside looking in,
You're not the only one who said that. Don't worry.
Well, Danielle, my great grandfather came here in 1924 as an artist. He's a painter. And he painted a wonderful oil painting of our original library. And if only we had that building. So when you ask about the library, I think of the library. So you know what? For better, for worse, it's ours. So we better love it and adore it and nurture it and make it ours.
All right. Let me ask you just a couple final questions about how you see your role as an elected council member, because there is going to be a referendum on the municipal ballot on a provincial issue, on the issue of equalization. Are there any candidates for referendum questions that you would put to Edmonton about local issues? Or do you feel comfortable making those decisions yourself? How do you see your role?
I had not contemplated that question.
Or just more generally about putting a question to, maybe it's because in Southern Alberta, Calgary's had two referenda. They're talking about fluoride, but they also did one on the Olympics. Yeah. And in the past, Edmonton has two on the issue of the closure of the city center airport, for instance. So because everybody's talking about referendum, and you're going to have one anyway. So I wondered, because it's provincial, I wondered if there was any discussion about whether some issues should be put to the people.
There hasn't been there has not been talk that I'm aware of a civic referendum question. I can think of subjects that are citywide and that are generating a lot of conversation. I mean, something we haven't touched on is the residential school program, and is there something civic that we ought to do? But I would say that on a number of these issues, we're not at a place where we can ask a question that has a binary answer. Like, I don't know that we've discussed the issues to a point where we can say, okay, here's our plan, yes or no, and ask that question. I take my role very seriously. I think my role is one part representing my constituents and taking their views downtown, and one part taking what's happened downtown and communicating with my constituents. So I spend a lot of time in community league meetings, in virtual town halls that I host, in coffee shop meetings, one-on-one or more. I spend a lot of time talking to people. Frankly, it is the most enjoyable part of my job by miles. So I am quite comfortable making those decisions because I am relatively comfortable knowing where my constituents stand and knowing also when they are split. You know, sometimes there is a 50-50 divide amongst people, which means we have to explore the issue more carefully to get to consensus.
You've already sort of touched on it, but let me just finish up by asking that, because you will find that there are times when the city administration is recommending something that they believe will be good for the city as a whole, but your constituents will disagree. When you have to make a choice, how do you balance that?
Well, then you're relying on your own views, I would say. You know, you take in as much as you can. This is perhaps the curse of being an engineer, is the paralysis of analysis, right? If you haven't got to keep asking questions or keep examining, and sometimes, you know, when you rewrite your spreadsheet, you're really engineering your spreadsheet to give it the outcome that your intuition is telling you that you want. So I think that at some point you need to decide what is the best thing for the city and cast your vote accordingly. Very few issues are 100% to zero. Mm-hmm. But most of them are 75-25, right? So it's those 50-50s that are really.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for the conversation today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That is Tim Cartmell. He is your candidate for Ward 9, pihêsiwin.